so we'll get started. Okay, we're going to now pull up the sources and we're going to look through what you learned. Okay, so let's open up and we're going to start from, sorry, I have to slide back up. We're going to start from first I want to show you something interesting in the Gemara. Since you looked at the Rambam, I want to teach you a tool. We kind of mentioned it last time, but now I'm going to mention it again, which is that there's this little, okay, sorry, let me try to zoom in. There's this little letter next to the Mishnah here. Here's the Mishnah, a little hey. That hey takes you to the Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvah, which tells you where you can find the halacha. Okay, like I said, the page has Rashi and Rashbam in our case and the Tosfot, which are commentaries on the Gemara, but it also tells you where you can find both previous sources and also later sources like the Rambam, for example, and the Shulchan Aruch. So if you look here, it says, hey, that's the same hey as it is at the bottom there. And it says Maimon Mem Yud Yud, that means the Rambam, Perek Zayin, Uperek Chet, Mehilchot Matzah, Halacha Bet. So that's how we knew to get to the Rambam, which I pointed out before. So that's just an interesting point about how to use the page properly. Okay, and here's a Vav, which also sends you to the same place. Okay, so let's go down and let's get started with our Gemara. I zoomed in too much. Okay. We're now on the Mishnah. Mazgulo kos sheni. Okay, so we now have, we're continuing in the Seder. We pour the second cup. V'kan haben shoel aviv. And now the son comes and asks the father. Okay, so now there's a big question. First question is, what's the connection between Mazgulo kos sheni and kan haben shoel aviv? So we end up with this interesting discussion, which is, how do we understand the connection? Are these things connected? Is it just we pour the second cup? And then that's just the beginning of this next section. We learned about how the 4 cups framed the Haggadah. Is that the idea here? And then we're up to the next part. Okay, so now the son starts to ask. Notice, by the way, what's missing? Halach ma'anya. Halach ma'anya doesn't appear here. Okay, or the Sephardi edition, Bebihilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim. Those do not appear here at all. So now it says, Mazgulo kos sheni v'kan haben shoel. Now, if you looked forward, you see that the Rashbam has a commentary here and brings 2 different opinions here. So he starts off and he says, kan haben shoel. So he says, kan b'mizigat kos sheni haben shoel et aviv imu chacham. So what will he ask if he's a smart son? Right, this already gives you this indicator of the smart son, not less smart son. We'll get to that soon. Ma nishtana achshav shemozgin kos sheni kodem achila. According to the first interpretation here, there's a direct connection between what the pouring the cup and the son asking. And the son says, why are we pouring a second cup of wine? Normally, we don't do that until we're already eating, and we're not eating now. So what's going on here? So that basically prompts the question. Okay, so according to this, now, what's the question according to this? What's the son supposed to ask? Well, in fact, it seems like the son's supposed to ask, why are we pouring the second cup? And not what we normally think of, the son asking, ma nishtana. The second interpretation of the Rashbam is, Rabbeinu kibel mirabo, Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakal. So my rabbi learned it from his rabbi. V'chein haben shoel. Now, it was important for him to say this was passed down because he's saying, I'm not making up my own version here. But the difference between kan and kain, and we'll talk a little bit about manuscripts today, is that kain is just missing the letter aleph, right? And you can say it could be, right, it was just a typo, whether it went one way or the other. Somebody thought maybe to add the aleph or somebody took away the aleph. V'chein haben shoel, and then he says it's like kain benot Tzlofchad, which is when Moshe says the daughters of Tzlofchad spoke truly. They were correct in what they said. And here it means v'chein haben shoel, and thus it's appropriate for the child to ask, and this is how the Rashbam explains, klomar din hu she'eh shoel b'mizigat kos sheni ma nishtana. At this point, we're explaining the mizigat kos sheni has nothing to do with why he asks now. It's just saying we're up to the next section of the Haggadah. And this section is the telling of the story. And how does the telling of the story happen? Well, the son starts asking a question. And then what's the question that he asks? Oh, manishtana. And then let's go back to our Mishnah now. The Mishnah reads like this. Kan haben shoel aviv. So now the son asks. Now, like I said, in the Mishnah, it doesn't say what the son asks. So the first interpretation of the Rashbam is going back to, and he should ask about why we pour in the cup. And if you remember, in the previous week, we learned about the children asking questions. And we said, right, 2 weeks ago, and also last week we discussed it, there's all sorts of things we do in the Seder to get the children to ask. And if you notice, what were the things we do? So we dip twice. That happens to be mentioned in the questions here. But the previous week we discussed, we give them nuts and toasted, roasted grains. Now, do you see them asking about that? Well, it doesn't say manish tana halayla hazeh, that we pass around toasted grains. It doesn't say that here. So it seems that one way is to say the child is just supposed to ask all these things that seem strange. And really, it's supposed to be a free form type of question, as opposed to the second interpretation of the Rashbam, which really says, V'chein haben shoel, and this is what the child should ask. And then, right, im ein dat beben aviv melamdo, either he asks, now, according to this interpretation, it means he asks the manish tana, the questions that we know to be the manish tana, the way we do it nowadays. And if the son doesn't know, well, then the father teaches him how to say it. And then he asks, manish tana halayla zemikol halelot, right? How is this night different? And then they proceed to list the questions, which we'll get to in a minute. So just to be very clear, there's many different ways to read this line. Either mazgulo kosheni is just an introduction. This is going to be the second part. This is what we're doing. Then the son starts to ask, and then he asks the questions that are the typical questions that we're supposed to be asking. And then there's a split between a wise son who knows already the manish tana, knows how to ask, and a son who doesn't really know. And then the father's supposed to teach him to ask these questions. But then according to that interpretation, they're all really asking the same question. According to the other reading, no. Mazgulo kosheni is the prompter. That's supposed to get the kid to start saying, what's going on here? Something's weird. And there's also a talk about akirat shulchan. They would take the table off, which we now do is the Seder plate, right? In those days, everyone kind of sat with a little table in front of them. So moving the table was kind of just the same idea as taking off the Seder plate. And that's also supposed to prompt questions. And then the kid's supposed to ask, well, what's going on here? Why are you doing this? And then the child's supposed to ask his own independent free or her own independent free form questions. And then how do we read the next part? Well, if the child's not wise enough to ask, then you teach them, and then we have a text for you. Here's a bunch of questions, and now I want to even have this split into two. Either the Mishnah is just suggesting, here's a bunch of questions you could throw at your kids if you don't know what to do, right? Here's a way of what you could do. Versus the other option, say, no. Here's a text we'll give you. Here's a written text, right, with questions. You can read these questions in the event that you don't know. So we've now read the Mishnah in a variety of different ways. Okay, you see this one text, which looks kind of simple at first glance, can really be read in many different ways. Okay, now let's go through the questions. Okay, so before we get there, I wanted to point out two more. We're now going to see, besides the Rashbam, also there's another two different versions of how to read this story. So the first thing is this Ktav Yad Kaufman. Ktav Yad Kaufman, which Ktav Yad is another word for a manuscript, which now Sefaria just started this new manuscript feature. You can find the manuscripts of Mishnayot and other things. So you can find all of Ktav Yad Kaufman. It's the earliest, most complete manuscript of the Mishnah, which I wrote here. It's believed to be transcribed in the 10th or 11th century, either in Israel or in Italy, they believe. Now here's I wanted to bring you the manuscript so you could really see what it looks like. So here's Mishnah Daled. The Daled is the name of the Mishnah, the number of the Mishnah. Mazgulo kos sheni, v'chein haben shoel. So you see the earliest edition had it not the way our text appears, had it as v'chein and not v'kan. Our printed edition was not necessarily taken from the best. It was whoever the printer had access to, whatever manuscript, that's what they used. Sometimes they fixed it up. Here you see on the manuscript, someone corrected it. You see the word ein on the side here? Okay, I'm kind of making a circle around it. So it says, v'chein haben shoel, im dat beben aviv l'amdo. If the son knows, the father teaches him. There's a little teeny arrow there, like when you're writing, and you write a little thing, if you forgot a word. So here, the person writing forgot a word. He wrote it on the side. Add the word ein. It should say in ein dat beben aviv lamdo. If the child doesn't know, then the father teaches him. That's clearly a typo. But the difference of v'chein and v'kan is not a typo. So it seems like the earliest manuscript of the Mishnah actually supports the reading. This is what the child's supposed to read. Okay. However, if we look down at the Rambam, so the Rambam has a very nice description in Perek Zayin, and then he goes into more kind of how to in Perek Chet, chapter 8. So let's read the Rambam. The Rambam says, "Mitzvah lahodia labadim, afilu lo sha'alu, shene'emar higadet labincha." Now, the whole premise of this question and answer format really comes from the Torah. The Torah says you're supposed to ask your child. The Torah also says when your child asks, this is what you're supposed to tell your child. And there's a lot of this idea of telling over the story. So he says, even if the children don't ask, you still have to tell them. That's where this idea comes about the ben she'eno yodea lish'ol that we have in the child that doesn't know how to ask. Lefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo. So again, each child according to their level. And then he gives a description. Okay, now you would think, so how do you teach? Okay, let's go through our Haggadah. But he doesn't give you words from our Haggadah. What does he tell you? He tells you have to explain it in words. The idea of the Haggadah is not to recite a text. The idea of the Haggadah is to discuss and to engage in conversation and to get the children, and really not just the children, but everybody at the table, and we're going to get to that soon, to think about what this night is all about. So ketzad, maya katan o tipesh. Interesting, he uses that word. Tipesh means stupid, not exactly a word we would think to use, but if the child's young or can't, doesn't have a sharp enough brain to think, Omerlo. So instead of, if they can't ask a question, start describing it in a way that your child will understand. Bini, kulanu ayinu avadim, kimo shifcha zeh, o kimo evet zeh. Right? Take an example. You have, right? In those days, it seems he must have had servants around. So a lot of other people did. So he said, go say, oh, look, you see this servant working for us or this slave? That's like what we were in Mitzrayim. And then you basically tell this story. And then he says, and if he's gadol and chacham, so then you teach him what happened in Egypt, the miracles that happened, and all according to their level. And then he says, right? You have to do changes, things that are atypical. Why? And then once he asks the question, then you answer them. Now notice what he doesn't say here. He doesn't say what the language of Manishtana is supposed to be. He's saying you're supposed to ask, why is this night different? But not necessarily the text of chametz and matzah and all the vegetables, and right? That's not what he's saying. Okay, yet it's very clear here that he just means you want them to say what's going on here differently. Why is this night different? Okay, and then it gives you a whole list of things that you should do to change, which are all the things that we saw, grabbing the matzahs and all those things and giving them the klayot and the egozim and taking the table off, removing the table, which are all not things that appear in the 4 questions. You notice that? So it's very interesting what's going on here. Okay, then he goes into him, right? If you don't have a son, then the wife asks and all that. Okay, yeah, let's go down a little bit more and let's see what the Rambam says then, what we do. So the Rambam says, Omer HaKoreh manishtana halayla ze mikol halilot, right? So, I skipped an important line. So then if the Rambam in Hilchot Chametz Umatzah Perek Chet says, Mozgim HaKos HaSheni v'kan haben shoel. So the same thing, but notice his language, kan haben shoel, which again matches the first version of the Rashbam, that it's a reaction to the pouring of the cup. And then he says, really interestingly, V'omer HaKoreh manishtana halayla ze mikol halilot. It's not for the children. It's for the reader, the narrator of the evening. In other words, the son asks his questions, and then we narrate and we say, by the way, your questions are questions about why nuts and why, kind of the things that we threw in there to get you to start thinking. But I'm going to tell you what the real questions are of the night. And these are the questions that you should be asking, because these are the questions that are really essential to the evening. Okay, so that's the Rambam. Now, I want to show you the comparison. If you got to this, I don't know if you all finished this, but if you got to the comparison, it's very interesting. Okay, I'm a big believer in charts. Anyone who does the daf with me knows that. a chart shows you a lot. So here we have questions number, okay, you see the Ktav Kaufman has 3 questions. The Rambam actually has 5 questions, and our Mishnah has 4. So what you notice is this 4 questions, it sounds like this magical 4s and all the 4s of the evening, wasn't necessarily clear that they always have 4. And the question is what's in which one and why? So the Mishnah has, I don't know all the answers as to why, but I can suggest some things and maybe you came up with some ideas of your own, or you will come up with some ideas of your own. So our Mishnah talks about chametz and matzah, vegetables and maror, okay, roasted meat only. Maybe we should go back and read the Mishnah inside because we didn't read this part, and then dipping once, and then tonight we dip twice. Okay, so if we look back at the Mishnah says, Shebechol halelot anu ochlim chametz u'matzah, halayla zeh kulo matzah, right? This matches what we say. We eat chametz and matzah every night, and tonight only matzah. Shebechol halelot anu ochlim sha'ar yirakot, all other vegetables, halayla hazeh maror. We cook our meat in all different kinds of ways. This night we eat only roasted. Right, which you probably don't recognize because we don't say that. My kids all know that we kind of have to make mention of it because it's in the Mishnah. So in our Seder, we always make sure to make mention of the fact that in those days they used to do this. Why did they change it? So that you saw in the Rambam. The Rambam said they changed it because in this day, they no longer, I don't know if you didn't get to it, I'll at least just tell you that the Rambam says, after the destruction, they no longer have the sacrifice anymore. Once there was no sacrifice, so it's not only roasted meat. When it was the sacrifice, they only roasted it. But then there's no sacrifice, you don't need to do this. Now, this is a whole interesting issue. I'm not going to get into the details, but anyone who learned the 4th chapter of Pesachim, if you're doing Daf Yomi, you definitely learned it. There was a minhag. Some people ate roasted meat and some people didn't. And that was after the destruction. So it seems that for the time period after the destruction, it's very likely that there were people still only eating roasted meat. After a certain time, they decided to forbid it because they didn't want people thinking that what we're eating is the korban, the sacrifice, and it's really not anymore. And eventually it changes. And it's also indicative of how the generation immediately after the Churban was kind of, after the destruction, was still kind of keeping with things that went on the temple. And over time, they diverged from it. Okay, that's just an interesting side point. So that's why it's still in the Mishnah, because it could be in the time of the Mishnah, even after either this was from before the destruction only, or even after the destruction, because remember, the Mishnah time period overlaps with the destruction of the temple. So it could be that this was even after people were still eating roasted meat. The next one is a little bit tricky. This is different from the version that we have. According to the Mishnah, it says, all days we dip once, this night we dip twice. And then the Mishnah continues to say, and then according to the knowledge of the child, the father teaches him. In other words, now that we got past the question part, now we're going to get to the answers. That's going to be more part of the second part of tonight's shir, which is then it says, you start with something of disgrace and you end with either praise or glory. You learn those psukim and you, what we call darshan them, okay, which we'll get to later, until you finish that whole section in the Torah of Arami Oved Avi. We'll talk about that later. So now getting back to the Rambam and Ktav Yad Kaufman. So the difference here is that in Ktav Yad Kaufman, which one's missing? The maror is missing, okay? Now, a good option as to why the maror is missing could be that dipping is really the maror and the vegetables, right? It's the same idea because the maror we dip, right? We learned this last week. It's the same thing. We do any vegetable for karpas, and then we dip the maror. So on all of the nights we eat vegetables. Tonight we make sure to eat bitter herbs. So that's why once you have the dipping once and dipping twice, it's already 2 questions on maror. It doesn't make so much sense to do that. And that's why it's possible it didn't appear there. The Rambam adds, what's interesting, he adds this sitting and reclining, which is exactly what we have. And then he points out that the roasted meat one, after the destruction, they no longer did that one. And he has the reclining one. Now, why wasn't reclining a question in the time of the Mishnah? Right? So if you're hung up on the number 4, so you say, well, our Mishnah had 4. They didn't need it. But another possible answer is because it was common to recline in those days. We talked about that when we talked about reclining. And it could be that reclining was not seen as something that's so different. And that, again, the questions are meant to be things that appear as very different from the norm. But if they're not different from the norm, then there's really no reason for it. Okay, Tosfot points out a very side thing, which is why doesn't it say kulo maror? Like it says kulo matzah, and that's because we eat other vegetables. That makes a lot of sense. It's not the only vegetable that we eat. And now I want to end with this last source. Okay, the Gemara, we're now getting to the first section of the Gemara. It's introduced by Tafresh. Tafresh is short for Tanu Rabbanan, which is we learn in a Braita. Chacham beno sho'alo. So if you have a Chacham, then his son asks him. Chacham beno sho'alo. If his son is wise, he asks him. V'imeno chacham ishto sho'alto. If the son can't ask, then the wife asks. V'imlav hu sho'el atzmo. Like if you're sitting there by yourself or you don't have anyone who can ask you questions, then you ask yourself questions. Why would you do that? It seems a little bit weird. So this goes back to something which I assume most of you are familiar with, which is that the whole Seder is modeled on this question-answer format. And that's because it's a very good way to learn. It keeps people interested and engaged. And even yourself, you get more engaged when you ask questions. So then it says, and here comes a very interesting line, and I don't know if you picked up on it, but let's try to think about it. Now, if you read this source not so carefully, what do you see here? You say, okay, well, if you have two Talmidei Chachamim who know a lot, they still have to ask each other questions. But notice something that's weird here. You would think it would say, Sheyodim what? Yodim, the story of Pesach, right? They know the story, they still need to ask questions and tell the story again. But that's not what it says. It says they know Hilchot HaPesach. And from here, it's going to take us to our last two sources for tonight, which is, for the first section, which is Maaseh Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. This is very famous from the Haggadah. And Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon that were in Bnei Brak for their Seder. And they were telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim Kol Oto Alayla, right? They sat there all night telling the story until their students came and said, Rabotenu Igi Azman Kriyat Shema Shel Shacharit. That everybody knows. But here's a less known source, the Tosefta. Okay, also a source from the time period of the Mishnah. The Haggadah, we don't know where this came from. Actually, I forgot to check if it's an actual source that we have from somewhere, but it's probably a Tannaitic source from somewhere. Then the Tosefta says, Maaseh b'Rabban Gamliel Uzkenim. It sounds very similar. It's just different person. Shayu masubim bebeit baitus ben zonim belod. They were in a different house and in a different place. Okay. V'hayu asukim b'ilchot haPesach kol halayla ad chot hagever. Notice what they were doing. They weren't talking about the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. They were talking about the halachot of Pesach. Okay, and then the same thing happens, and then they realize how late it got. The rooster crowed. It wasn't that the students told them, and they realized and they stopped what they were doing, and they went to the Beit Midrash, presumably to pray. Now, what's interesting about these stories? What's really interesting about these stories is that we have two tracks here. Again, this is what you're learning all across the Gemara, that there's always at least two different opinions here. One track is the mitzvah of telling the story of Mitzrayim is all about the story. And that's what we know of. That's our Haggadah. Our Haggadah is based on the story. But this version is all about halacha. It's about halacha. And why halacha? Well, this is a night about our tradition. Our tradition is steeped in Jewish law. And this approach is to say we're supposed to talk about Jewish law. Now, there's a little bit of Jewish law in the Seder, but not a lot of it. Like Yachome Rosh Chodesh. You might have thought the mitzvah was from Rosh Chodesh. And then they start saying, no, it says by Yom Hazeh. And then there's a whole halachic discussion. But there's not much of halachic discussions in the Magid section. So it seems that this is an approach that we didn't exactly adopt. But it's very interesting to see. And what's interesting about it is also it comes up in the four sons. If you notice in the questions, and this is a whole other shir about different versions of the questions of the four sons, and the questions that are in the Torah don't match the answers given in the Torah, and a whole interesting thing about that. But one of the interesting things is that if you look at the Chacham, and in a different version, it actually is to the simple son, the answer is a halachic answer. Whereas you teach him the Hilchot HaPesach, ad ein maftirin achar Pesach avikoman. You start teaching him halacha. That's not the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So for some people, Yetziat Mitzrayim is all about the laws that we got when we got out and we got the Torah, and that's part of the tradition of the story. To some people, no, it's the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And that's the difference in the answers that some of the sons get. Some of the sons are answered in a halachic way, and some of them are answered in God took us out of Egypt and the story. So it's interesting to see how there were these different tracks, even if not all of them actually really ended up getting passed down to us. Okay, we're going to stop here and we're going to do a 10-minute chavruta because we're getting a little bit late here. So a 10-minute chavruta now, and then we will come back together and do the second part.